Hello everyone, what's up? It's your Mistress, the Queen of Lions here. Welcome back to another episode of Shadows and Pretties. So today in this episode, we're going to be talking about, The Walking Dead Season 1. Now, I'm going to go through most of the episodes that I'm seeing right here. Well, the first season, by the way, from episode 1, A New Day, all the way to, the 400 Days. I am going to be explaining about this story. So, I'm going to mainly explain about the plot of this, for each episode. I'm not going to explain, too much of the choices, but, I kind of will mention them, but except for making this extremely long by talking about all the seasons of Telltale's The Walking Dead, I am going to be sitting there and basically explain, what the plot of it all is. Just so then that way you guys have a better explanation of it. So, with that being the case, if you happen to play the game, feel free to, let me know in the comments below. But yeah, with that being this case, I am going to be sitting here and, I guess we can get started on it. So, with that being the case, this story with all episodes. First episode, A New Day, begins with Lee Everett, who's on his way to prison for killing a guy in a fight. While leaving Atlanta for the prison, being dropped by the police officer, they eventually get into a car accident, and that's where Lee ends up killing the walker from the crash. Of course, Lee eventually meets a young girl named Clementine, who is hiding in her treehouse, and they meet Sean Green, with Chet, or the police officer, depending on your choice, if you want to leave during the day or at night. Of course, later on in the first episode, we see Clementine and Lee meet up with a family named Katja, Kenny, and Duck, who are Kenny and Katja with their son Duck. That's basically Kenny and his family. So after failing to save Sean from the walkers, Lee, Clementine, and Kenny's family are banished from the farm. When the group heads up to Macon in Georgia, they meet up with a group of survivors led by a woman named Lily, who basically who is basically a big, she's a big B. So you could probably say about B when I mean it's a cuss word. You probably will understand. Lily's group is situated in the drugstore that Lee's parents own. They soon find out, which the group gets in the scuffle with Lily's father, who quickly encounters a heart attack afterwards and acquires medication from the nearby pharmacy. So, of course, being another member of the group, Glenn decides to scavenge supplies at the motel. Of course, getting stranded in the motel, Lee, along with Carly, the news reporter, go to save Glenn. So, of course, Glenn decides to try to help a survivor, but however, the survivor Arlene reveals to be bitten and basically takes her own life. Upon arriving to the drugstore, Lee confronts the conclusion of his parents that were killed by walkers. Eventually, Carly finds out that Lee is a killer, and basically, he can have a choice to trust her or anything, but she keeps his secret for a while. Now, of course, Doug ends up finding out where the keys are of the pharmacy, and of course, Lee is forced to kill the rim of his brother, his undead brother, in order to retrieve the keys. So upon entering the pharmacy, the alarm sounds go off, forcing the group to leave the drugstore after giving Larry his medicine. So upon leaving, Lee has a choice to either save Carly or Doug, depending on your choice. If you either go with Doug, Carly dies, or if you go with Carly, Doug dies. So, of course, Larry knocks Lee out cold, but of course is rescued by Kenny, and the group heads out from the motel upon the shelter. So when they were leaving out, hearing Atlanta's overrun by walkers, Glenn leaves the group and eventually heads back to the city to save his friends behind. So that's basically the end of season 1, episode 1, sorry. I'm not going to go through every single choices or anything, because if you've not played, Telltale The Walking Dead, you probably might not remember any of the choices, or probably just get confused partway through. So I thought, I'd sit there and, give out my explanation. So, with that being the case, and with that being said, there is also another thing that you guys should know. So, Star for Help is episode 2. The episode takes place about 3 months after they're at the hotel, but of course they're running low on food, and they eventually have to, yield a little by rationing it and all that. So Mark, later is a new survivor, later comes across some high schoolers named Ben, Paul, and Travis, and their teacher, David Parker. So, of course, Ben's 2 companions die in the chaos of having one from a bear trap and the other dies or reanimates despite not being bitten, and Ben reveals that being bitten is not the way one could become a walker. Simply the act of dying could cause them to turn, which I find that BS in my opinion, because you mainly have to be bitten by a zombie to be one of them, but it's Walking Dead, so I really didn't expect much from it. So, We eventually meet the brothers of Andrew St. John and Danny St. John, who live by the St. John's Dairy, which offers food and shelter in exchange for gasoline and their generators to power up the electric fence. So the group accepts it, though. They remain uneasy about the whole situation. While they were there, Mark gets hit by a crossbow from the group of bandits while attacking the farm, and Brenda and the brothers first takes them to the house for medical treatment. So later on afterwards, Lee goes with Danny to find the bandit camp, and they come across one crazed woman named Jolene, who appears to know something about the farm, but of course she eventually kills it before she's killed before she reveals it. And Lee finds a battery-less video camera on the monster possessions along with Clementine's hat, which of course Clementine's hat does go missing in the episode. So with that being the case, they were still uneasy about the farm. Lee and Kenny discovers a butchering room full at the back of the barn, but of course before they were called for dinner. Lee excuses himself to look for Mark. She finds him near death with his legs cut off and warns about the St. John's. Basically, I'm just not going to say the actual word because, well, it's not ad friendly. I'm just going to leave it at that. But yeah, I'm not going to actually say the actual word because it's not ad friendly. I guess you could really put it at that. But of course, St. John's Dairy basically eats each other up, like kind of eating their own, well, you could probably get the picture. But of course, they overpower them and they end up separates them in the butcher's freezer. Larry, of course, dies from a heart attack, but Lily tries to do CPR. And now at this point, you could either help Lily save Larry or help Kenny kill Larry, depending on your choices. Now, of course, Larry, however, in any way was killed by Kenny, realizing that it was too late for Larry to be feared upon being trapped with the walker. Of course, they find a vent in the freezer, and of course, Clementine helps them escape by quickly entering the vent and opening up to the other door. Of course, later on, they eventually save everyone, and the group end up getting eaten by zombies and all that, and the rest of the group of St. John's Dairy were basically done for. So, on the way back, the group finds an abandoned car with food and supplies, so the survivors in the group takes it. And of course, they end up finding out that Jolene's player finds out that she had been watching the motel, knowing that the group was safe as long as the St. John's maintained their deal with the bandits. So that's the end of episode 2, which is Start for Help. Now, episode 3, Long Road Ahead. Now, without the St. John's, the bandits have returned their attention to the motel, and Kenny expresses the urge to move on using the RV that he fixed up. Although Lily and Lee discovers that someone had been slipping the supplies with medical supplies to the bandits, but before they could determine on who was the one who doing it, the bandits eventually attack and was followed by a horde of walkers. The group then flees in the RV, forced to leave most of their supplies behind. Kenny and Katja eventually finds out to Lee and tells her that Duck has been bitten by a walker. Lily was furious over the theft, accuses one of them, like either Ben or Doug or Carly, for it. So, depending on who you save in episode 1, Lily ends up shooting either Doug or Carly dead, and the player has also an option to leave Lily behind or continuing on the road without her. Which, of course, if they continue the road with her, she eventually steals the RV later on upon arriving at the train, and they meet a homeless survivor named Chuck. So, of course, they eventually find the train still and unstable to shape and move towards Savannah. Eventually, they get the train moving, and Kenny assures that they can find a boat and flee to mainland. But of course, Duck's condition gets worse, and Lee convinces Kenny to stop the train to deal with him. So Katja takes Duck out to the forest, and of course, before Lee and Kenny could realize the last minute, they eventually find out that Katja ended up taking her own life. So Lee and Kenny are forced to shoot Duck. So the player could choose whether they would have Lee shoot Duck or Kenny do the same thing. So after the brief monitoring, they came across a train towards Savannah. When Ben reveals that he's the one been slipping supplies to the bandits, Lee gets furious, but of course he doesn't tell Kenny till later on. When they eventually get to the bridge where a tanker car was blocked of the way, they encountered a couple named Omid and Krista, who decide to help clear the blockage and offers to join the group. So they do so, and shortly after the tanker car was cut loose, it's revealed to the noise that had been made in a bunch of noise to the group. The train eventually travels at the point and causes a large amount of walkers to congregate and pursue them, and who managed to catch up to the train at this point. Of course, with that said, they were able to escape the walkers, but of course Omid injures his leg and is brought safely aboard the train. So, of course, they end up finding out that Clementine's walkie-talkie suddenly perks up, and on the other side was the voice who basically had the other talkie, and he's just the other guy who basically tries to kidnap, well, Clementine, which is later on. Now, that was episode 3, Long Road Ahead. Now, with episode 4, Around Every Corner, this is like one of the longest episodes I've seen. Now, the episodes of the Telltale series are pretty long. If you've played The Walking Dead, you would probably understand where I'm coming from. So, Around Every Corner, basically the group makes it to Savannah and is walking through the streets towards the river. However, they unseen a person, or Molly, rings the church bell, and of course they find out the man talking to Clementine over her walkie-talkie eventually warns the group to hide as the walkers are approaching. Of course, overrun by walkers, Ben panics and leaves Clementine when he was supposed to protect her, causing Chuck, the survivor, to be separated from the group upon saving her. Lee and the others eventually make their way to the backyard for an empty mansion, and they were able to break in by finding up a pet door with a chipped collar, and of course the house finds it to be safe. They found a young walker that Kenny finds in the attic, starved and dehydrated, who is even too weak to even attack, who resembles Duck. And with that said, Lee decides if he or Kenny should kill the walker. So, of course, Lee buries the body with the dog and ends up noticing that someone was watching him. Lee's, of course, with that said, Omid's leg begins to worsen and Kenny wonders out loud if it's time to leave him behind. But the next morning, however, Lee and Kenny end up heading for the waterfront when they find a church bell goes off again, luring the walkers away and reaching to the docks. Kenny and Lee eventually finds all the boats sunken or stripped for parts. While looking for boats, they get attacked by a figure named Molly, who basically says that she rings the bell to draw the walkers away upon hearing that there were areas of scavengers. So Molly also warns about Crawford, which is a survivalist community that upholds itself by adopting more of a social Darwinism, some concepts. So of course the gunshot from Kenny's gun soon attracts the walkers and forces the group to split up. So Lee escapes the sewers by himself, and then after finding Chuckster being eaten by the walkers, discovers a hidden community of cancer survivors who were hiding from Crawford's soldiers, is greeted by Vermont and Bree. The former being of the doctor in charge of the group, who is assumed to be Lee is from Crawford, and Lee eventually pursues Vermont to tell him that he isn't, to show him to get him back to his house, and they give him medical attention to Omid. However, back at the house, this is when Lee and Clementine discovers that the shed contained the boat. The boat said they needed gasoline and a battery, so they had to go to Crawford for the school or something that happened to be having, all the, supplies that they need. So as they get the supplies, Lee ends up eventually rescues Vermont and Krista, who basically wants to get into the medical supplies, the medical room to get some medical supplies, which of course, with that being said, they ended up reviewing a recorded medical examinations of Anna, a citizen of Crawford, being forced to terminate her pregnancy by the doctor the group sees, and of course they end up putting a security code before he is killed by Anna. Now, their actions intentionally causing the outbreak to happen at Crawford. Watching the optional third tape reveals Molly was a citizen of Crawford and was basically trading favors with the doctor in exchange for her diabetic sister, which is insulin or whatever it's called. Now Lee meets up with Molly and confronts her about the tape, but only for Ben to, cause the walkers to break in. So as soon as they got everything, they had to, get out of there as soon as possible, but eventually Ben ends up telling them about, what he did with the bandits, and this caused Kenny to snap and tries to attack, Ben, but of course that's not the case. The group eventually escapes from Crawford, and when they eventually do that, Ben had a choice to either die by falling down or Lee to save him, which is kind of hard to depend on their choices that Lee makes. But later on, of course, when they eventually get back to the house, Vermont gives Omid the medicine and talks to Lee in private about taking Clementine to his group. But it's depending on, Lee's choice, neither of them sound good. Lee did not want Clementine to go with Vermont because I think maybe he didn't find him trustworthy or something, which is very understandable, in my opinion. Now, of course, with that being said, she decides to leave the group and says goodbye to Lee, but of course, tired from the day's events, Lee eventually sits down to watch over Clementine and falls asleep. When he awakes for the next morning, he finds Clementine gone and discovers that Clementine's hat and walkie-talkie laying outside. So, of course, when Lee goes to get, Clementine's hat, Lee is then bitten by a walker before killing it. And of course, when Lee is found by the group, he has a choice of showing his bite or not. He shows the bite and determines to rescue Clementine. So, of course, the group all decides to go ahead and try to find, Clementine together. So that is basically episode 4. Around every corner. Now we're up episode 5, which is No Time Left, which is the final episode of season 1 of Telltale The Walking Dead. Lee continues to speak with the stranger who claims that he has not stolen Clementine but rescued her from Lee. Lee, of course, eventually collapses from his bite and has to choose whether to have his infected arm amputated to slow down the rate of the infection or just leaving it the way it is. Which, of course, the group finds Vermin's crew had stolen the boat, causing an argument. If Ben was saved, Kenny finally forgives him for following an outburst, making a stand to becoming the Horde. So the survivors try to hold the mansion, but eventually follows to hide in the attic. Contacted briefly by Clementine, Lee eventually learns that she's at the Marsh House Hotel where her parents were staying. So the group decides to try to find a way out, but Lee converses that they have several numbers and eventually has a talk with Kenny and Krista. Well, of course, they decide to realize that they need to induce a miscarriage, which of course we find out, yes, that Krista is pregnant. Well, I don't know if this was even possible to know at the time, but yeah, she was surprisingly pregnant this one. So, later on we see that, they eventually find a way out of the attic, which is breaking through into a neighbor's house, and they eventually find a couple who basically took their own life together. And Kenny refers from the hopeful look of the survival, admits blaming himself for the death of Katja and Duck. The group eventually jumps to the balcony on the rooftop. Of course, if Ben was saved in the previous episode, the balcony collapses and Ben gets killed. But of course, Kenny refuses to leave Ben and spares him from the pain with the bullet before it runs off and is assumed to be taken down by walkers. If Ben was killed in episode 4, Kenny will sacrifice himself by helping Krista retrieve Clementine's walkie-talkie before we find out he's devoured by walkers, which that doesn't happen. So if you've seen season 4 till season 2, which I will definitely explain in the next episode. With only Omid, Krista, and Lee remaining, the trio reach the coast and attempt to cross the rooftops over a sign. However, Lee gets separated from them and tells them to either return to the train or find a boat or meet back together to help save Clementine. Fighting for the walkers in the streets, Lee eventually reaches the Marsh House Hotel, where Lee meets Clementine's captor, revealing himself as the owner of the station wagon at the end of Starve for Help. He begins that how stealing supplies resulted in his wife and leaving his daughter before they were killed by walkers. The man insists on helping the player's choices over the course of the game. Explain how Lee's actions make him a monster, and now Clementine is much safer that if he kills Lee. However, they were talking, Clementine quietly escapes from her locked room, and the man starts addressing his wife's head, basically Lee, about what happens, carries in a bowling bag, giving Lee an option to either attack the man or allow Clementine to strike. So, of course, that said, upending the stranger, Lee could decide whether to kill him or let him turn into a zombie. So, if Lee is not overtaken by the stranger, Clementine shoots him in the head, saving Lee from dying. Reunited with Clementine, Lee is ambushed by a walker who does not attack and goes for Clementine, realizing that the walker blood is covering him from earlier fights, disgusting him. Lee eventually covers himself and Clementine in its blood, hiding their smell from the walkers and allowing them to safely exit the hotel. As Clementine spites her undead parents, Lee eventually collapses from blood loss and/or infection, forcing Clementine to drag him to the storage facility. Close to death, Lee explains to Clementine that he was bitten, and to walk, she instructs him on killing a trapped walker, which is, of course, find another escape route. Handcuffed one to the radiator or handcuffed the trapped walker, Lee attempts the parts of the advice at Clementine, depending on if the walker's person's choice of the game ends with a broken-hearted Clementine, which I could definitely say this one was actually pretty sad. Seeing Lee sitting there and, either, becoming a zombie or even have Clementine shoot him is pretty sad. Now, of course, her is leaving him to be a zombie if Clementine does not choose to shoot him. But of course, during the epilogue, a distraught Clementine is mourning over the death of Lee, walks to the countryside and stops to rest on a log, and spots two figures far in the distance. So basically what happens is Clementine decides between calling out or remaining quiet. It turns out to be Omid and Krista. So that is basically, well, the season 1 of The Walking Dead. Now, I actually find this to be rather amazing and well done, especially with the whole concept in that it's just really well made in detail. I actually like how this episode went out. Like, it was a pretty good one when it came to, well, the whole episode. Seeing, Clementine getting, going on this adventure. And, the good thing about this is that this episode ends up, having, well, you could definitely say Clementine doing her little own adventure after Lee sacrificed himself to save her, which is very amazing and well done. So, with that being the case, I'm going to sit there and explain about, I guess we could definitely say the 400 days. So, with that being the case, let's talk about the 400 days. Now, the 400 days is basically takes place to focus on the 5 different protagonists, Vince, Wyatt, Russell, Bonnie, and Shell, on their own little short personal stories in the geographic area. Of course, this is also between the events of what happens in season 2 and a bit in season 1. So, with that being said, at least you can play this game, which if you have, the special edition or something, you will definitely understand the whole concept. So, with that being said, basically what happens in the plots of the stories is that each story takes place at different points from the first season, and of course of the view of a different point of Survivor Nero Gill's pit stop, which all contains their choice of playlists to make. So, there are a total of 5 choices, which are the same amount of choices as every single player made in season 1 or season 2. Vince's story basically starts off with the day before the outbreak and then allows to get him arrested, do adjustment to the zombie outbreak amongst other survivors. With that being the case, Vince eventually, is on his way to prison when that happens, just the same way Lee did. Now, that was taking place in day 2. Now, day 41, which talks about Wyatt's story, which, of course, it follows an escape with his companion from a zombie, and they eventually finds out an aggressor turns out to be a zombie that they hit. Now, Russell's story, which happened at least not too long ago, Russell has a story about him being picked up by a stranger after hitchhiking along Georgia Road, and that's basically what goes on. So, Bonnie's story basically is about her being followed through a cornfield by a group of mysterious flashlight-wielding figures, and her subsequently attempt to defend herself. Well, Shell's story takes place around this time. Shell's story allows her to create a self-refugee in the central truck shop, along with her sisters and her fellow survivors, notably the cancer supporter survivor group who are the last seen in Savannah around every corner. That's what goes on in Shell's story. So, with that being said, there are different, choices, like, Vince's story, you given 2 choices. Same thing with Wyatt's story. Russell's story, Bonnie's story, and even Shell's story. They're like different titles with that. So, at the end of the 400 days, the epilogue follows Tavia, who is attempting to persuade a group of 40 days, is an attempt to come with her to join in a safe community. The choices the survivor made, as well as the dialogue choices of Tavia, will determine on who goes and who does not. This carries on to season 2, which we'll learn about what settlement Tavia tried to lead them into, which, of course, that is, the part thing. So, if you do all this is actually a pretty good, interesting idea of how you can get certain characters to come with you in that. And yeah, it's based on your choice too. So that's basically what happens. So with that being said, this story was actually a pretty interesting, the 400 days. Talks about some survivors that, in another group that we will be mentioning in season, 2. So that's basically season 1 of The Walking Dead, Telltale, and the 400 days. So, what did I actually think about this? I actually found it to be a rather interesting, concept and interesting, episodes that I could see. Like, I love how this game went out. Like, when I first saw this game, I first played this back in 2016, I actually found the first season to be really, really well made. Like, I love the story. love the characters, and I got really sad when it came to, well, Lee eventually dying, but with that being the case, it was actually pretty amazing. So, with that being the case, I'm gonna sit there and say that this story was actually really amazing, to be honest. So, with that being the case, I'm gonna sit there and say, right now that, I actually found this story to be rather enjoyable. It was actually a really enjoyable story, in my opinion. I actually do like how the characters went out. It was well made in detail, and I actually definitely have to say that I do like how, it all went out. So, with that being the case, I actually found this story to be rather amazing, in my opinion. So, with that being said, I'm gonna definitely say that this story was actually really well made in detail. So, with that said, I actually found this one to be pretty cool. So, of course, I actually liked this season. Now, I can really say all the episodes were good. Like, I don't have, what episodes I don't like or anything. But I could definitely say there were some characters that were pretty likable in the season one, and even though the 400 days as well, there was even some that were actually pretty good. But some of them were just not that great characters, at least to me. But other than that, it was actually pretty well made in detail. So I definitely have to say it was actually interesting sitting there and watching this. So, with that being the case, I'm going to sit there and say, well, I actually found this story to be not that bad. It's actually a pretty good story. And I definitely have to say, there's definitely lots of time and effort into it. So, I definitely have to say, I really do find this story to be rather enjoyable and really well done. So, with that being the case, I actually found this story to be pretty good. So, in matter of ways, I actually said that this story actually looked pretty well done and really well made. Actually found this story, the whole concept of Lee and all that, it's just really well done of how, Lee would sit there and, go through all the adventures and that. I definitely have to say, there was definitely a lot of time and effort into this. So, that's definitely a very good thing when it came to this story. So, I'm definitely saying that this was actually really well made and detailed. So, with that being said, I like all the episodes in season one, but I also like the 400 days. So, I really like them all. I can't say, anything negative about it, although there were a few characters that I didn't really care about or anything. But other than that, it was a pretty good story. So, with that being the case, what did you all think about the season one of The Walking Dead or the 400 Days? Did you all like it? Did you not? Also, what would you have done personally to help make these games a lot better? Leave me know what your thoughts are down in the comment section down below. I'm the Queen of Lions. Thank you so much for watching today's episode, and if you happen to be brand new here on this channel, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, because I make brand new videos every single day. Don't forget to ring the notification bell to when I upload, so then you guys will not miss an upload. And as always, please roll the outro because I'm out of here, and I'll be catching you all in the next video. So, peace out, everyone.